So my cardiologist keeps sending me x-rays of her heart. I think she just wants me to know that her heart is in the right place. All right, cardiovascular system. What are we going to learn about? Well, we're going to learn about how this pump works. We call that pump your heart. It's actually two pumps that are fused together, right? One's pumping up to your lungs and the other side's pumping to your body at large. And what connects all of those pumping parts? Blood vessels. So we'll be also talking about the different types of blood vessels you have and their functions. Let's get to it. One, the pathway of blood through the heart. There are two major circuits, your pulmonary circuit and your systemic circuit. And let's follow the blood. We are going to start, because it's just such a great place to start, in your right atrium. So which side is that? Well, remember, whenever we're looking at these diagrams, right, we're not looking at like the left side is our left side. It's like, no, our left side is the patient's right side. So the right side of your heart is this one, which is always shown as blue. Why? Because this is the side of the heart that is pumping oxygen-poor blood. Your blood is never blue, ever, never. Maybe if you transformed into a horseshoe crab, their blood is actually blue because what's carrying oxygen around in their blood is copper. What's carrying oxygen around in your blood is iron, one of the key pieces of the hemoglobin, which is the key protein inside of your red blood cells, and they are red. They are not red/blue cells. The reason why, when you look at your skin, you might be able to see your blood vessels like a little blue, is that's just a refraction of the light coming down through your skin. As it comes back to your eyes, it looks blue. But indeed, your blood is always red. It is either just super bright red if it's been recently oxygenated, or it's a little darker, duller red if it's oxygen poor. We use this convention because our eyes have a hard time being like, oh, that's bright red versus, oh, that's kind of a darker, bricky red. So this is just a convention for us to easily see where the blood is oxygen poor versus oxygen rich. Awesome. This side that is oxygen rich is the left side of the heart. So let's follow this circuit around. On the right side of the heart, you'll follow those arrows, right? So we'll get more into the chambers in a moment, but you have 4 chambers to your heart. Here's chamber 1. The atrium goes down into the ventricle and then out through that ventricle, and it's going to pass into your lungs. You'll notice in your lungs, we're transitioning from blue to red. So as you're probably aware at this point in your life, right, you are breathing in air that is oxygen rich. That air travels through your lungs, and your lungs are full of capillary beds. That's going to pick up the oxygen into your blood. So we're doing oxygen in here. And another key feature to understand, equally important, is you are also exhaling carbon dioxide. So oxygen comes into your blood in what's known as the pulmonary circuit. So our pulmonary circuit here is this one that leads, our right side pumps oxygen poor blood to our lungs. And then that blood is going to return to the left side, once again, going through an atrium and a ventricle. And as that ventricle squeezes, then that blood is going to leave that ventricle and go out through the aorta, is the main blood vessel that comes out of the left side of your heart. And it's going to branch. This diagram is super, super simplified, but that aorta branches. Some of those branches go up to your head and your arms. Other branches go to your torso and your legs. Those are all going to go through capillary beds. And it's feeding oxygen to your entire system. So this is called your systemic circuit, and not just the capillary beds, but the aorta and the arteries that lead to those capillary beds, and then the venules and veins. A venule is just a small vein that then returns to the right side of the heart. So from the left to the right side of the heart, we call that the systemic circuit. And as you can see, it is delivering oxygen and nutrients to all of those cells in the capillary beds, and then it's picking up carbon dioxide and other waste products, delivering it to the right side, which then will, we're back in the right side, right? So when I say it makes that figure 8, that's what I mean. It has to go up and around through the pulmonary circuit, back to the left side of the heart, and then back and around through the systemic circuit. And of course, your blood is doing more than just delivering oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. Blood's full of things. You're also delivering nutrients and hormones and vitamins and glucose and ions, potassium, sodium, calcium connection we've been following, right? And you're also getting rid of other waste products or moving things around in the body. Urea, for example. So here's one that's a little more detailed now that you kind of got the basic figure 8. And you, of course, have some animations. It's always, I think, nice to see this actually pumping and moving. It's going to help you visualize how that heart is working right now in your body. So here's a little more detail. Same idea, right side's the blue side, left side's the red side. And notice your right side. Let's just start at that right atrium again. We're going to go up and out, and now you have not one, but 2 lungs, right? So that blood vessel splits, and one side's going to go to the right lung, one side's going to go to the left lung, going to go through capillary blood beds in the lungs, and then return to the left side of the heart. And now that we're on the left side of the heart, change my left side of the heart, right now that left side is going to pump it to our systemic circuit. And you'll notice here that even this doesn't show all the detail, right? Because you actually have 3 main branches that come off the aortic arch that go to your upper body. So things that include your arms, your head, your upper torso. And then the descending aorta here is then going to branch and go to your various abdominal organs. These are just a few, as well as your legs. And then all that blood gets collected in a blood vessel that returns to the right side of the heart. Likewise, in your upper body, all of that blood gets collected to a vein that leads to your heart. So something to notice here is you have 2 veins returning blood from your systemic circuit. The dividing line between what's coming in through your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava is the, for it, any guesses? That's a good guess. Might even be right. Is the diaphragm. Whoa! Too early on the G. So that muscle, right, that's dividing your thoracic cavity and from your abdominal pelvic cavity, that muscle that helps you to breathe, that's also the dividing line for the upper, superior and inferior systemic circuits. So all of the blood that's draining superior to that diaphragm is draining into the right side of your heart through the superior vena cava. So that's what we mean by superior. Vena, vein, cava, cavity. Inferior vena cava is everything that's in your body that's inferior to the diaphragm. Let's name some more stuff. Your heart has 4 chambers. You have 2 atrium and 2 ventricles. So the atrium, like the entry place for blood into your heart, and then that's going to pour into the ventricles. And it's the ventricles of your heart that's going to do most of the work of pumping the blood, putting the blood under pressure so it has enough force to move through your body. Let's name some blood vessels. So what do you know? Let's just take a moment, and where do you see arteries versus veins, and how does that relate to your heart? Oh, good question. So aorta is the main blood vessel that comes out of the left ventricle, and then it branches into other arteries. So where are the arteries? Yes. Oh, no. Yeah. Wrong. Okay. So your arteries, notice as you leave the left ventricle, you have an aorta that then is going to branch down into arteries that then branches down into smaller arteries that we call arterioles. And from arterioles, we get down to the capillary beds. Same things occurring on the left, or excuse me, on the right side. That out of the right ventricle, we have pulmonary arteries. From arteries, we go to arterioles. From arterioles, we go to capillary beds. So can an artery carry oxygen poor blood? Oh yeah, where does it do that? In your systemic circuit. So in a moment, in a few more moments, we're going to be talking about the anatomical differences between arteries and veins, and I think that will help this make even more sense, but we just are laying the foundation right now. But arteries, when blood is moving away from your heart, it is in an artery. These are the blood vessels that can handle high pressure. And you get pressure when the ventricles are squeezing, right? So whether you're squeezing blood to your lungs or to your entire body through the systemic circuit, that blood is leaving through an artery. So arteries away. Anchors away, arteries away. They both start with A. Hey. Okay, then we go from arteries, arterioles down to these capillary beds. And on the other side of the capillary beds, we have veins. Yeah. First, we have venules, because those are small little veins. And then from venules, those branches converge into larger veins. And from veins back into the heart. So where do you have oxygen-rich blood running through veins? Oh, you guys got this. Nice job. Yeah, in the pulmonary circuit. That we have these pulmonary arteries, oxygen-poor blood, but under pressure because it just got pumped by the ventricle. It's going to the lungs, capillary beds where gas exchange is occurring, and then veins. We are going to return that blood to the left side through the veins. So in here, we have oxygen-rich blood in veins, which is might take you a second, right? Because whenever we usually see things like oxygen-rich bloods through arteries and oxygen-poor bloods in veins. Well, that's true, but only in the systemic circuit. It's flip-flopped in the pulmonary circuit, which you're never going to get confused with again, because you know that arteries are all about life under pressure, just like Queen. So if that blood's under pressure, it's going to be carried through the body in an artery. Okay, moving on. Why do your cells need oxygen? Why are you breathing this stuff in anyway? Why are you going to die if you stop breathing in oxygen? Please don't do that. Yeah. In order for your body to survive, it needs energy. And little unit of energy that your body can actually use is called ATP. And this is a small molecule. This is new to you. Let's do a little chat. Fireside chat about ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Tri as in 3. Tri as in Yoda. right? So it's basically, you can think of it as this. It's this blob with 1, 2, 3 phosphates. That looks like googly eyes. I meant that to be a spring. So this third phosphate is this bond here that's holding phosphate number 2, the phosphate number 3. This has a lot of energy in it. And your body's using that energy to do all sorts of things. Like, as you saw with, right, in order for actin or for myosin to walk along actin, in order for it to have that ability to walk, you use ATP. In order for your neurons to fire, you use ATP. In order for you to build new cells, you need ATP. You use it for all sorts of things. I think about it as your body's rechargeable battery. So how does your body use it? Well, it's going to break this bond here. And once it breaks that bond, then the energy gets released. And now we go from ATP to something called, yeah, you got it. Instead of triphosphate, we have a diphosphate. So it's called ADP plus a phosphate. Now it's like our batteries are dead. Now what do we need to do? Well, both of these are now going to get shuttled back into our mitochondria, where they can be, that bond can be rebuilt and it can make ATP. And that whole process is called cellular respiration. So where does the energy come from? Well, the energy comes from the food that you're eating, and glucose and fats and proteins. In order to access the energy that's stored in that glucose that's going into that mitochondria, oxygen helps with that whole thing. And long story short, oxygen catches some electrons and hydrogens at the whole end of this thing to make sure this whole thing keeps going. So your oxygen actually becomes water. And your glucose, which starts out as C6H12O6, that is going to be broken down and it becomes CO2. So the CO2 you're breathing out right now was whatever you had for breakfast or lunch or dinner, depending on what time of day you're watching this. That's where that carbon comes from, that you are exhaling. So why do your cells need oxygen? It's a longer story than you thought it would be. You need oxygen in order to make ATP. If you do not have enough oxygen, your body stops making ATP and your cells die. So very handy to have oxygen. The other thing to recognize about this, oh wait, you thought we were done. So you definitely need oxygen, but as I mentioned before, you've also got to get rid of carbon dioxide. Here's why. Carbon dioxide, when it's in your blood, mixes with water. And when it does that, it makes something called carbonic acid, which is H3CO2. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that. Yeah, see what I did there? Multitasking. H2CO3. I knew there was a 3 in there somewhere. Anyway, this thing is called carbonic acid. You'll be learning more about that in physiology if you decide to take that. And the problem with acid is it releases hydrogen ions. The problem with hydrogen ions is they have a charge and it interrupts all kinds of physiological processes in the body. It doesn't function so well, and if things get really bad, it leads to death. We're trying to avoid that. So we exhale. So exhaling carbon dioxide, also important, as is inhaling oxygen. You need to do both. Now that we have the overview, let's talk about heart anatomy. Do you know where the atrium are in this heart? I was really surprised the first time I looked at a heart. These tiny little flaps right here, let me get a different color so it'll show up. This little, they look kind of like little dog ears. That's little atrium. The rest of this are the ventricles. And this line right here kind of divides the right and the left. So here you're looking at the right side, here you're looking at the left side of the heart, and those tiny little atrial flaps, they just contract a little bit to help finish the blood rushing into the ventricles. And about 80% of the filling of those ventricles just happens because of the blood pressure of the blood coming in from the veins and flowing in. And at the very end, so the heart's all relaxed, both the atrium and the ventricles at that point. And then at the very end of the relaxation, the atrium go boop, and they finish filling up the ventricles. And shortly after the atrium go boop, then the ventricles go whoosh, and they're the really forceful part of your heart. So your heart weighs about a little less than a pound. And where is it located? Sits right on top of the diaphragm. And between what ribs, if you were to count? Well, here's rib 1, and here's rib 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6. Yeah, so somewhere like between ribs 2 and 6, behind the sternum, which is why CPR works. Yeah, okay. And then here's another view of the heart. We would say it is intermediate to the lungs. Notice that the bulk, right? The bulk of the mass of your lungs is actually kind of behind the heart, and it's slightly to the left side of the body. Do you know what these tubes are here? Right, okay, hopefully you got, that's the spinal cord. Yep, this is your aorta. That blue things means it's a vein. And this one is the esophagus. Okay, so what keeps your heart in place? Because it's busy, right? It is beating all the time. So what's holding it in place? Yeah, that pericardium. So remember we learned earlier this semester about the serous membranes that go around the lungs and the heart and your intestines. So, and what was the major function? Yeah, it was reducing friction, right? Well, it's also anchoring your heart in place. So the outer layer of that pericardium has collagen fibers imaged here, right, that are anchoring your heart next to the diaphragm. Man, I really want to skip that A. And it's also anchoring it to the major blood vessels that are on the superior end of the heart. So we've talked about, right, here's the inferior vena cava, blood's flowing into the right side of your heart. Here's that aortic arch, as well as this is the pulmonary vein, right? So blood's coming out of the right side and going into the pulmonary vein. So those are the three major blood vessels that are on the superior end of the heart that the pericardium has collagen fibers that are helping to anchor that heart and keep it in place. And then it's snuggled in between your lungs. So the pericardium is important for a few reasons, right? It's got this pericardial cavity in it. Do you remember what's inside of there? Yeah, that serous fluid, super slippery. So we're reducing the friction as the heart is beating. It anchors the heart. And it also has this really thick fibrous pericardium. So it's that outer layer of the pericardium that's super thick and fibrous. And that's helping the heart that as you're running up a hill and it's starting to beat really hard, it's kind of holding that heart in place and preventing it from overfilling too much. And remember that the basic shape of that serous membrane is like if you had a balloon full of a little bit of serous fluid, and then you stuck your hand in that balloon as if you were the heart, and then that balloon shapes around your heart, right? And that double layered sac allows 1, reduced friction environment, 2, anchors the heart, and 3, protects it from overfilling when you're super exerted. Okay. Remember where the atrium is. Fantastic. This is the heart without the pericardium. It's hard to find a good picture of one with it. So let's look at this one again, and then note the layers of the actual heart wall. So there are 3 layers. One is the epicardium, and that is part of the serous membrane. And then 2, you have lined on the inside of the heart is endocardium, and this is a cavity in the body. So what kind of cells are going to line that inner cavity? Yeah, epithelial. And in the case of your heart, they are simple squamous epithelium. And those simple squamous epithelial cells are continuous with the simple squamous epithelial cells that line the inside of your blood vessels. It's really important that they're simple squamous epithelium because in your capillary beds, where the nutrient exchange is going to happen, you need a really short distance in order for exchange to be effective. But their other role inside of your heart, as well as your blood vessels, is it makes this really smooth, slick surface that allows the blood to flow with ease along your blood vessels, as well as inside the chambers of your heart. And then the bulk of the thickness of that heart wall is the myocardium. And that myocardium means muscle heart. So this is the cardiac muscle tissue that is actually producing the contractile force of your heart. And when we look at that cardiac muscle tissue, unlike, say, your bicep, where all of the cells are going in the same direction, in your cardiac muscle, they kind of twist around and form these bundles that have a little bit of swirling action. And then if you are actually to look at a video of the heart as it beats, it doesn't squish like that. It actually, the beating starts down here at the base or the apex of the heart, and then it kind of wrings itself out. It actually kind of does this twisting motion. And as it twists, or it's pushing blood out. The other thing to note that's different about your heart versus your skeletal muscle is there's no bone to grab to pull leverage against. So remember way back, so many weeks ago, we looked at this, which was just the connective tissue skeleton of your heart, right? And that is mostly collagen fibers. So that is an image of a heart that's been flushed. All of the cardiac muscle cells have been flushed out, and all we have left is this connective collagen fiber framework that basically serves as a skeleton structure of your heart, so that all of those cardiac cells have something to pull against, so that the heart can kind of ring itself as it's moving blood through the heart. So here is cardiac muscle tissue underneath a microscope. I hope you remember a few things. One, that it's striated tissue, just like your skeletal muscle tissue. And those striations are due to those actin and myosin fibers that overlap a lot in some places and not so much in other places. And that gives that dark light striations. But then some things that are different between your cardiac muscle tissue and your skeletal muscle tissue are these darker lines here, here, here. Do you see one more? Oh yeah, you see a lot more, right? And those are called those intercalated discs. And that's where two cardiac muscle fibers are coming together. And the reason why I'm using my fingers is because they're not flat when they come together. They actually have all these undulations that help them to interlock, right? Having undulations, that gives them a lot more surface area to interlock with than if they just were flat. And by having lots more surface area, it's a major theme, then there are places for more, do you remember the type of cell junction that keeps things from pulling apart? Starts with a D, rhymes with yep, desmosomes. So as we look at that cardiac muscle tissue, right, here's all that surface area where the two come together. We call that intercalated disc. And cardiac muscle tissue also has the myosin and actin and the sarcomeres. So they're shortening in the same way where the myosin is walking along the actin. And we also see the same idea here. We have that sarcoplasmic reticulum where what's being stored? Yeah, that's the calcium storage. And that calcium gets released, and that's what reveals the actin, binds the troponin moves the tropomyosin out of the way, and then the myosin can bind to the actin. All that's the same. However, where they come together, a little different, right? Lots of surface area. This is what you can kind of see squished in here is a mitochondria. And one of the really fascinating things about your cardiac muscle cells is like around 20% of the volume of a cell is mitochondria. Compare that to your skeletal muscle cell, it's more like 5 to 7% mitochondria. Whoa. Why do you have so much more mitochondria in your cardiac muscle cells? Right? All day long, 24/7, doesn't stop beating. It needs a lot of ATP for that. Be a really bad day if your heart ran out of ATP. Mitochondria is making the ATP. So your cardiac muscle cell has lots and lots of mitochondria to help make sure that it doesn't run out of ATP. Held together by desmosomes, right? These are the ones that are preventing them from being pulled apart, as we have all these pulling forces occurring on these cells. And we also have, remember these guys, the gap junctions, which basically are tubes. So what's the function of those gap junctions? Well, things are a little different in our cardiac muscle cells. So perhaps you'll remember what a motor unit is in your skeletal muscle. Yeah, so remember the skeletal muscle has an axon that comes down and it's going to branch a few times, maybe a few hundred times. And at the end of each one of those branches, you have a neuromuscular junction, and every single one of the cells inside of your skeletal muscle has a neuromuscular junction. And when that axon fires, it's going to excite those cells and they're going to contract. This is not true of your cardiac muscle cells. Not every single one of these cells in your heart has a neuromuscular junction. What gets them excited and what coordinates their contraction are these gap junctions. So reach that point where I just got ahead of myself. But to shorten this portion that got a little longer than I had planned, nice snagly. So if this was our little sketch of our heart, where we have the atrium and the ventricles, in this right side of the heart here, you have what's called a group of cells known as your pacemaker cells, known as your sinoatrial node or your SA node. And they're the ones that determine your heart rate. And from there, they spread that excitation or that signal that it is time to contract not through your nervous system, but through these gap junctions. And through these gap junctions are flowing ions, things like sodium and calcium. And because they're charged, that's carrying this electrical current through your heart that helps it to beat as one fabulous pump. Let me know if you have questions. Okay, so the heart has 4 chambers. We've talked about that. We're going to do that again. And so can you remember what's the name of each chamber? And now we're going to introduce the valves of the heart and their functions, and how they help determine the pathway of blood through the heart. There are links here. You have them in your Canvas shop. If you haven't watched them yet and you're feeling totally lost, hit pause, go watch those, come back here. You have the power. All right, so you'll remember, right side, oxygen poor side, right? So this is our right atrium. Blood flows into the right atrium through these blood vessels. Worry about those later. Into your right ventricle, right? And then out of your right ventricle through an artery, also known as your pulmonary trunk, but it's a pulmonary artery, goes to both lungs, comes back from both lungs in through your pulmonary veins, and great, because you have a right lung and a left lung, so that's why you have those two dual pulmonary veins coming in from both sides, and then they fuse together on the back side of your heart. Actually, they don't. They come together in your, so that's going to flow into your left atrium, and then these are going to flow in basically back here through your left atrium, and then through your left ventricle, and then back out through the aorta. So let's talk about the role of these valves. So the whole purpose of these valves is to keep blood flowing in that one direction. They are preventing backflow. That's their whole job, which is a really important job, because if blood flows the wrong way in your heart, that leads to all kinds of diseases. Things like congestive heart failure, which can be quite deadly. So you want those valves to be working properly. Let's talk about those valves. You have 2 valves. You basically have 2 types of valves in the heart. One are the atrioventricular valves. Guess where those are? Between the atrium and the ventricles. Let me write that down so you can see that word. So atrioventricular. Here and here. And actually all of this white extension, that's the valve. So on the right side, it has 3 panels to it, or cusps. So it's called the tricuspid valve. And on the left side, it has 2. So it is called the bicuspid valve. And somebody at some point in history said, oh, that valve with its 2 sides looks like a mitre hat. So they called it the mitral valve. For my brain, it's just easier to call it the bicuspid valve. If you have a hard time remembering, man, tricuspid valve on the right side or the left side? Here's how I remember it. In our culture, the right thing to do is to use TP, toilet paper. So on the right side, you have the tricuspid valve followed by the pulmonary valve. Here's our pulmonary valve here. So right, TP. That's how I remember it. Oh, the left side? This is how I remember it. Do I remember what the left side is? Bah! Of course I do. Bah being bicuspid, and then the aortic valve. Here it is right here, tucked in back there. That's your aortic valve. So the aortic and pulmonary valves, those that are known as your semi-lunar valves. And they are between the ventricles and the arteries, either the pulmonary arteries or the aorta. And that's nice. They're just named after the arteries that they're next to. Pulmonary valve, aortic valve. Okay. Yeah, I know. It's super cool. What is this stuff? So chordae tendineae are also known as heartstrings. You do have them. Someone might have played with them at some point in your life. Okay. What are heartstrings for? Well, they are anchoring that valve to the the cardiac muscle, or specifically this little extension of your cardiac muscle known as the papillary muscle. If those weren't there to anchor the heart, then here's what would happen. The force of those ventricles is so strong that if this wasn't tied down to that papillary muscle, that valve, instead of just closing, which is what it should do, when the ventricle starts to close, it would blow out the other side and blood would go backwards. It'd go back into the right atrium. So because there's so much force from that ventricles, those valves, your atrioventricular valves, have to be essentially tied down to the inside of the ventricles so they don't open up with the force of the pumping of your heart. Here's a picture of them inside of the heart. Great shot. So they're anchored to that papillary muscle, heart contracts, and those chordae tendineae, or those heartstrings, are going to help keep those blood, excuse me. How about heart valves? Heart valves in place. All right. And here's a view of your semi-lunar valves. So here we are looking at that collagen skeleton of the heart again. And now you're looking down through one of the arteries into that valve. And so here, let me outline this valve for you. So here's the valve, and you can see it has three little flaps that come together. And what closes those flaps? Well, let's talk through it. So we're following the blood through the heart. So blood flows from the atrium into the ventricles. Step one. As blood is flowing through those atrium and ventricles, then eventually those ventricles are going to fill with their total volume, and the blood's kind of turbulent inside of the heart. You don't really want it to stop because that causes blood clot. So kind of turbulent around in there, and that starts to go up next to these valves and starts to close it. And then as the heart starts to contract, this muscle starts to contract, then that puts that blood under pressure, and that's going to close our atrial ventricular valves. Essentially the same time. The right side and the left side close at the same time, within microseconds of each other. So they slam shut. That closing of that valve makes the lub sound of your heartbeat, the lub-dub rest, right? So the rest is while your heart is relaxed, neither the atrium or the ventricles are contracting. The heart ventricles are filling up with blood. The atrium are going to contract just a little bit extra blood into the ventricles. The ventricles start to contract and lub. That sound is from the atrioventricular valves closing. Now you'll notice at this point that all of the valves in the heart are closed. The AV valves are closed, and so are these semi-lunar valves, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. And what's holding those closed? Well, there's pressure, but this still has blood in it, and that blood is falling backwards down on that valve, and that's what closes it. When the ventricle squeezes enough that the pressure inside of this ventricle is higher than the pressure in the arteries, then that opens up our semilunar valves or our aortic and pulmonary valves. It's a great animation. So this pressure inside of here increases, and that's going to force our semilunar valves open, both the aortic and pulmonary at the same time, because the right and left side of the heart is squeezing all at once, right? It's all being coordinated through those gap junctions. And then blood leaves the heart, and then the heart starts to relax. And as it starts to relax, then there's no more pressure being put on, or a lot less pressure being put on those ventricles. Now, is the heart totally empty of blood? No. At the end of any given heartbeat, you still have about 50 mils, give or take, depending on how hard your heart is beating. But it's not that there's no longer any blood in your heart. It's that it's just not shown in this picture because they're trying to show you where the blood's going. Anyway, as the ventricles relax, now the pressure inside of these two arteries is higher than the pressure inside of either one of these ventricles, and that's going to slam these semilunar valves, both the aortic and pulmonary, closed. So it's the pressure of the blood, the backflow, essentially. So one of the problems that can occur is if this valve starts to fill, then this blood starts to fall back down into the heart and becomes much less efficient. So one more time, you could answer this now, right? What makes the lub-dub or lub-dup sound, depending on how you like to pronounce it? Well, the heart? Yeah, the closing of the valves. And which valves close first? The tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, the atrioventricular valves. And then what closes next? Yeah, the semilunar valves. So these two are the dub, and the tricuspid and bicuspid are the lub. And that's what makes your heartbeat sound. What's going on with this surgery? What do you think's failing? Is it the left or the right side? Let's get there first. And how do you know? Yeah, it's the left side, right? So here's our aortic arch. So that tells us we're on the left side. And what's going on? Well, we've got this bypass here that's going from the base of the left ventricle and taking blood back to the aorta. So this surgery is done if our aortic valve fails. It's one way they can deal with it. It's not the only way. So what they do is as the heart beats, now some of the blood is going to go out the aortic valve, and some of the blood is going to go out through this synthetic valve. And so that reduces the amount of pressure on this aortic valve, and that helps the heart to beat more efficiently and can reduce the progression of diseases like congestive heart failure. But there's still enough blood coming out through this aortic valve that can feed your head and arms, but not so much pressure that it's going to put undue pressure on that valve that's not doing so well. Yeah, I know. So many different types of heart surgeries you could watch for lunch. So let's talk about the right versus the left side. And if you look at this image, which one do you think is the right and which one do you think is the left, and why? And then when you think about blood volume, when every time your heart beats, right, you've watched the animations now, so you know that the right and the left are beating together. Do you think that the right side or the left side or is pumping more volume, or are they pumping equal amounts of volume? Question number one. That's the next question we're going to talk about in our Zoom room. And then what about blood pressure? What do you think is higher on one side or the other, or is that equal, and why? All right, we'll talk about it then. We'll use this picture to continue that conversation. So heart transplants is another surgery that can be done with the heart. If the heart has had enough damage, say from a heart attack, and enough of the cells have died, some reason that heart is diseased enough that it just can't beat. And so we can now, not me, medical doctors that have the correct training, can conduct a heart transplant. So what do? Well, they remove they transplant the heart, right? They cut at all the major blood vessels and pinch them off shortly, and then insert the new heart and stitch it all back together. Now, what's amazing about why this is possible and why you can't do this with a bicep goes back to the nervous system. So do you remember how in your bicep, every single one of those cells has to be hooked up to a motor unit? And then that motor unit has to be part of a nervous system. To date, we do not have, the human technology, medical knowledge does not have the ability to link nerves up together. Like we don't know how to do that. But your heart has an intrinsic conduction system, which means it doesn't actually need to be hooked up to a nervous system in order for it to beat. Now, your heart is, well, unless you had a heart transplant, but barring that, your heart is hooked up to your autonomic nervous system, both your parasympathetic and your sympathetic. However, it doesn't have to be in order to work, which is why this surgery can happen. Let's talk about it. So, as I mentioned before, inside of your heart, you have pacemaker cells. So 98, 99% of all of the myocardial cells in your heart are ones that are going to contract. And about 1% of those cells are specialized cardiac muscle cells that don't contract, and their entire job is to conduct this electrical signal through your heart to coordinate its contraction. And that's what we mean by the intrinsic conduction system. And here's where it gets started. So this little golden orb here in your right atrium is called the SA node, or your sinoatrial node. And that sinoatrial node can start, it excites all by itself. It doesn't need a nervous system to do it. And it's what's setting your heartbeat. And from your sinoatrial node, through those gap junctions, that electrical current is sent through your atrium and then to the second node here, which is called the AV node, or your atrial ventricular node. And from there, you just follow the yellow line. So that AV node, then the electrical pulse is going to go down through this small bundle, and it's going to branch so that it goes both to the left and the right sides. Those are called Purkinje fibers, but they're basically just specialized cells that allow this electrical current to flow through the heart through gap junctions, and that's what coordinates your heartbeat so that one half doesn't beat differently than the other half. If that electrical system fails, then the heartbeat doesn't work. All right, so it can do that all on its own. However, it does have some help from your nervous system. So both of those SA and AV nodes are innervated by both your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. So you'll remember which one's your fight or flight? Right, your sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is going to increase your heart rate as well as the force that your heart is beating. So it's going to pump more blood per heartbeat. And then your vagus nerve is part of your parasympathetic nervous system, and that's going to lower your heart rate. And so your heart rate, your heart's constantly getting signals from your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system. And it's just a matter of which signal is louder determines whether your heart rate is going up or going down. And why would it go up and down? Well, mostly your need for oxygen. Also, your blood pressure helps regulate whether your heart rate is increasing or decreasing. Great. So, after a heart transplant surgery, according to the paper I read, 2 to 24% of patients need a pacemaker. That pacemaker may be permanent, or it might just be until the heart kind of gets settled into its new home. Why do some patients need it? Some patients don't. It has to do with whether or not the heart can establish its own rhythm or not. Lots of factors play into that. You do have your adrenal glands are also, remember from the endocrine system, part of your stress response, and those release a hormone called epinephrine that can also increase your heart rate. So you've got more than just your nervous system that helps you to regulate your heart rate if you start exercising. All right. We have one more circuit to talk about. So there's the pulmonary circuit, the systemic circuit, but then the heart itself has its own special circuit, and that's called the coronary circuit or coronary circulation. Why? Well, because the heart needs oxygen and nutrients or else it dies. And if the heart dies, the whole system goes offline. So at the very base of that aorta, there are two places here and there where the left and right coronary arteries split off of the base of the aorta. So the very first branches off of the aorta actually go and feed the heart muscles itself. And those arteries are going to branch down into capillary beds, feed the heart muscle, and then from the capillary beds, then that blood's going to go into a series of veins. And those eventually all collect on the posterior side of the heart. So the backside of the heart has this enlarged vein called the coronary sinus, and that also drains into the right atrium. So technically, your right atrium has 3 blood vessels coming into it, 2 from the systemic circuit, the superior and inferior vena cava, and then 1 from your coronary circuit or from that coronary sinus. That's going to return the oxygen poor, carbon dioxide rich blood, and it goes through the whole system. So a heart attack occurs. Oh, let me show you. Right. So here's that coronary sinus on the backside of the heart that's going to, there's about right here. It's going to go, there's a tube you can't see that goes into the right atrium. Right. So heart attacks occur when plaques build up in these coronary arteries. And if the plaque builds up and blocks blood flow, then anything after that artery doesn't get oxygen and those cells start to die. We're going to talk more about how that develops, how those blood clots develop in our next lecture. But that's essentially it. I'll see you in the blood vessels lecture.